stuff.
Thanks.
Yeah, just with the interactions, sort of conformance content at the moment, I think we should consider, because I don't think it explicitly states any position on, say, there's an interaction. What's a good example? Identifier search. Search by identifier on a patient. It doesn't, I think, explicitly state only needing to implement that for effectively the must support slices of identifier that we recognize.
I believe, honestly, it does, in the
Can
sense
you
that
point
we
out?
have done that in a couple of places. So if we go to patient,
Oh, in the actual, yeah, yeah.
yeah,
It might be
we
nice to have a
haven't.
sentence in the.
So it's done in the capability statement, and it's also done here,
Oh,
but it's
how?
actually a should, not a shall.
So how's that stated in the capability statement?
Oh,
Just as
exactly like this.
like that. Yeah. Okay.
So these are shoulds and not shalls. They need
Yeah,
to,
yeah.
the requirement is to support search by identifier with both system and require both system and code values.
Mm,
But there's no requirement at this time that you have to support search by IHI.
mm. I might think about that one. Because I think if you're conforming to the data profile, I think it's mm, I think there's little point to implement the interaction if you're not supporting search by the must support elements. Yeah.
Well, identify. I'm
Slightly,
not so sure I agree. Sorry, Heath.
slightly off topic, but I think the media records guys felt that Inferno was actually asking that to support an identifier without a system. So we might need to double check that one.
Yeah, I checked with that, and it was Inferno was not correct at that time.
Right. Because I think, yeah, anyway, we'll take that offline. I just noticed that.
Yeah, cool. That's all right. I might go and write a ticket.
You're going to raise that in the ballot today. Okay. All right. Fine. I mean, well, possibly before Brett does anyone have any comments or anything we want to say about supporting searching using IHI's Medicare numbers or DVAs?
I agree with the idea that saying that you support searching without supporting searching using the must support slices of identifier just feels like it's against expectation in the spirit.
Philip?
I agree with the spirit thought process, but I think that in my mind, the practicality is going to be a challenge across most of the systems. So, like the patient theoretically doesn't know their IHI, and then not every patient will have a Medicare number or DVA number. So, at least today, I won't say that that's not the case 10 or 15 years from now, but not that I guess where my head goes is I feel more comfortable with the should statements here, being these, because there's going to be so many different combinations where you may or may not have a number. Plus, yes, you should be able to support birth date and names and some of the other kind of combinations, which may be the only way of getting at some of these patient details.
I guess one thing on searching by IHI is, does it count as supporting searching by IHI if you feed me an IHI and I search and none of my patients have got the IHI? So I faithfully say, on that IHI, I found nothing. I wouldn't
Yes, it
expect that
does.
I wouldn't expect there be any
Sure,
requirement to go and find patients whose IHI is that, but I don't know that.
but it may lead to the third parties creating apps where they're making a wide assumption that, say, an IHI is widely known. And it probably will be here soon with e-prescribing and some of the other pieces coming in. But today you create an app, most hospital systems will not know the patient's IHI and have a number of exemptions in place. So I agree that we could make it a must, and you just say, I can't find a patient by that. Yes, but what does that lead people to believe if they don't know that hospital systems widely don't have this information at the moment, right?
But if it's not required, and you can supply IHI, I can search and you could just say, I don't know, even though I know I can see it in the data. So yeah, it works the other way as well, which is if you do have it,
yeah,
and I can't guarantee
sure,
my search is going to return anything.
sure,
That's
sure.
that's quite annoying for a client. Yeah. Anyway, I'll go think about what I'm going to say.
Okay.
Put it in a ticket. Yeah.
All right. Oh, this was so interesting. I've actually lost where we were. What were we talking about when we popped onto this one on must support and performance?
Sorry, I've got another one.
Okay.
Yeah. It obviously only states these specific things in the should department, but it doesn't kind of explicitly state other things don't need to be done. I suppose that you can imply that, right? So you're not saying you need to identify. Oh, yep. That's good. Thank you.
Yep, no worries. All right.
I think you are just moving on.
Okay. All right. Back to, okay, I think that's right. We were coming back to this, talking about downstream IG impacts, and then we were moving on from this. Okay, I don't know that I really need to cover this one. We can, I think, move through this slide. Nice. Let's come back to this one just to reset this in people's head, because a lot of the time we go, oh, the must supports, the must supports, the must supports. But what we're really talking about are the obligations. And what the system behavior rules and the conditions and that we're setting on how things are handled. Must support is the flag to say that there will be some rules. What are they? Are they shoulds? Are they shalls? How does it impact system roles? And the requirement, generally, if an element has a must support on it, there has to be something in that IG that defines what that means. In AU core, we've got two system roles, the requester and the responder. And we have profiles, the same profile that we are applying the obligations on top of. So we're saying that we can define what those obligations are on a requester in dealing at an element level with those elements label must support, and we can do it as the responder. And what the rules actually are about doing that is the obligation itself. Obligations can be narrative, or they can use the new obligation extension, which we will have to move to eventually. And I'm very keen for us to move to that sooner rather than later. And to start to exercise that and put some of the feedback into the FHIR specification, because this is new and it's a process where we can drive some of the changes to make sure it's appropriate. I know there's some other ballot feedback that says move to obligations as well, so that'll be interesting. And I wanted to talk through some of that with you. I'm going to move past profile only unless anyone puts their hand up here to come on to this obligation concept. All right. Let's talk about obligations, which is now we're really moving into the system roles. We're talking about AU core requesters. We're talking about AU core responders, which are basically a client-server interaction. How can I ask for data? What do I get back? And the obligation extension in FHIR, which I do not have a link to, because I obviously did not review these slides carefully enough, in FHIR allows you to set that and to standardize that, and we'll standardize that across multiple IGs in Australia, but also internationally, because it's now using a standard extension and also a terminology that's set. And I'll just move to talking about the code. So here are the things that you can talk about and use to put rules on different items. So it has a list here that are selectable, which goes through and defines what are currently available to say what the obligation is on how to process this. There's some shoulds, so you can set these at the shall, should, and may level of that definition at the top here. Maybe if I click on that, here we go. So there's a number of codes. They are a combination of setting the shall, should, or may, and then what does it mean together to form a composite code. So it's like shall populate or shall no error. And it lets us set our requirements on how to deal with this at an element level. If there's things that we feel are shoulds rather than shalls, and we can define that, and then they can be strengthened later on if necessary. And I'm quite a fan of having this capability and having it be able to be standardized. Just see if that's so. Let me just also go to So here's what something might look like that does that. This is International Patient Access is moving towards having this. And when you set these on each of your elements, you will be able to define what this means on. And so International Patient Access appears to be doing basically the same thing, except down here there's a should. And using those codes to make clear on what that means. I think this has further obvious advantages beyond a really kind of standardized way to do this. That means that we're not coming up with our own language around that, much clearer language on how we do this, but also the opportunity there for tooling and ability to handle that in testing and conformance and compliance situations, which can interpret this. And also, I think then apply that and reason across more than one implementation guide, which I think is a great advantage when we're talking about defining something that is AU core and setting those minimum rules that we are expecting to be implemented widely, and to also look at compliance across multiple different use case or downstream implementation guides, multiple different systems that have their own particular use case requirements.
Hey Danielle, do you think that completely replaces mass support?
So I would love to. No, I mean yes. I think it does in terms of defining the conformance part of it. And I think so. We've got two definitions here. This says, what does shall populate mean? So if we click on that, that will come to, it's come to an older version. It's obviously not hitting that, but it would. We'll come back to this on what is shall populate. So then for IPA, that's saying performance applications producing resources shall include this element if a value is known and allowed to be shared.
Nice.
Just some similarities to our wording, but not exactly the same. And again, not the same as cardinality. populate can be admitted if no data exists or the data that exists is prohibited from being shared.
Yeah.
Which comes into that missing and suppressed data. And I think what we would still want is a narrative section, because we still need to do the things that have been asked around providing examples. What does that really mean? And I think that's always going to be present. The other thing we can do, though, how did I get here? Maybe it's this one, back. Yay! Is we move our actor definitions into a formal FHIR resource called actor definition. So these are our system roles that we would, this is not maybe a stellar example, but we would define what those are using the FHIR resource actor definition. That's the other thing we can do that also, therefore, just go to the latest one. Easy. It's quite complex. We wouldn't need that much, but it starts to let us move into a formal definition of the system roles. And then we would tie that into capability statements, and it all sort of starts coming together. Those parts of the FHIR implementation guides that had really just been narrative in the past are starting to move into this defined space that's governed by a FHIR resource and is therefore able to be queryable and compared against potentially. So big fan of where this is moving.
I see that the obligations, the must support is one initial statement, and then the obligations is kind of elaborating or clarifying the specifics of that must support.
Yes.
And as Danielle was saying at the beginning, where at the moment we've just got some narrative written in English, which is up for interpretation on what must support actually means in our profiles at the moment. And that's where I think we're getting a bit messed up, is because we're trying to interpret someone's English language. Whereas this is absolutely, well, it's still defined in English, but it's a little bit more agreeable with a common terminology around.
We just put up the slides that are, I think, sort of similar to, I was going to contrast, what do we currently have? So in client, and that's the wrong one. Old slides, my bad. Let's actually go back to a pause statement on requesters. Under must support. So this is, again, fairly open to interpretation. And AU core requester says, shall be capable of meaningfully processing resources with must support elements. Shall be able to process resource instances containing elements with missing or suppressed information. They're really basically the two kind of key ones, and we've gone processing. What is that? That's up to you. That depends on your local requirements. That might differ based on a whole bunch of things. You need to work that out. May choose to reject non-conformant resources, which I know we've had, I think, some comments before on that being confusing. And then shall interpret the missing data elements as not present in the source system when querying AU core responders. And if we came across to the value set that is going for, because that link won't work, that is available here, let me just put that in. I personally think that this is about all we really need to do in AU core, is to say that systems won't throw an error. Basically client systems. I think that's as far as we want to go in AU core. But it's an advantage of the obligation extension and codes themselves that we can select from this and make clear on what that means. I think, Brett, sorry, you had your hand up and I just kept talking.
No, that's all right. We'll have to think about actor definition as being, since it's an R5 resource, and what that means. And
so I've been speaking to Graham, or rather Graham is encouraging us in Australia to make use of these, and has backported that content into R4. So the IG publisher and the HL7 International and the Graham kind of tool chain all works with actor definition brought into an R4 space.
Oh, that's excellent news.
Yes.
Excellent.
Andy.
Part of me thinks that going down this path is going to create significant complexity that will then end up being something that drives people away. The other half of me goes, this is absolutely essential, because I'm not a fan of the one-size-fits-all kind of description. And I would tend to default to not including must support unless you actually had, in each specific instance, a clear understanding of those obligations anyway. Because if you don't have them and you're just kind of going, let's just default to the generic must support, whenever I've looked at it, there are very few cases that reconcile in my head in the generic description. They're quite a specific, often nuanced issue with the varying obligations or the varying actors involved. So I think I'm a fan of it, even if it was never formally used, but simply I think we have an obligation in the AU Core spec to be documenting these kind of obligations anyway, in terms of the things we write about the use of must support. So it's kind of a bit of a two-phased approach.
Mm-hmm.
So I completely agree. I'm in that same camp that I feel there's complexity here, but also we need to take away the ambiguity, and so that we can be much more efficient in these TDG meetings, because we all have a very clear understanding of what must support actually means. And we were talking yesterday after the TDG, and I'm basically looking at trying to rewrite these must support statements using these obligation terms. Now, I haven't started that. I don't know if it's possible, but that's my challenge in the next week.
Talking about challenges then and relating to this, I'm trying to build a branch that interprets, so we'll see if we come to the same conclusion, Heath, and that will be fascinating, on what I think those codes actually are on each of the elements, that will then let us have that discussion as a technical design group when we talk about, is this must support, do we keep it this way, to use this tool to be able to have that conversation.
Yeah, and basically where I was heading with that was that by default, these are the must support obligations unless otherwise stated specifically within the profile. That's kind of what I'm hoping that we might be able to achieve. I mean, there's, I guess, a problem from Graham's perspective that, from my understanding, on what people are wanting to do, which is to be able to compare obligations between profiles and things like that. If we've got this overarching default, which is really just still a textual thing, but
so I think, and don't quote me on this, I think one of the interesting cases, so yeah, that's one of the cases Graham is exploring, and it's something that I think we need to be cognizant of as well as systems that have to conform to multiple IGs and are going, well, that's great. If I have 3 implementation guides I need to be conformant to, and they all say something about this resource, what does that mean? So I think I see that as being, it would be very advantageous to have tooling that could run across them and tell you. The other case that Graham is, I think, looking into is enabling conformance schemes to sit on top of implementation guides and kind of addressing some of maybe the ONC kind of space. I think that's some of what I've seen the conversation looking like in Zulip and other places, and that looks quite interesting. All right, well, that seems to me that we're a fan of moving to standardized definitions of obligations, and to be able to have this, we can say something specific about this element if it is actually meaningful to say something specific about this element. Good, excellent, because this is going to come through our technical design group as a ballot resolution thing. I think there's multiple people who've sort of raised this as ballot resolution, ballot comments that we're going to need to resolve in this group. Let's pop back to then the obligation extension itself, which has more than this in it. And I don't know if we'd ever use these. I think that is probably much too complex, even if we adopted the obligation extension. Oh, that's the older version. Let's use this new one. So the obligation extension itself, and I'll see actually if I can tee up Graham maybe to give us a presentation on this and how he thinks it should be used and what the benefits are. I think that would be useful. I'm going to have to track him down though, because I'm pretty sure he's on like a road trip or something at the moment. So what we were talking about as what defines the obligation on an element that has must support flagged is this part of the extension here, so code. And that's what gets used, and that's mandatory. And then everything else are additional things you can say. So it looks like at the infrastructure level, they're also positing that you can declare that a profile itself has an obligation on it. And that's what this part would be used for. And then there's we also need the actor part to say this shall populate, or no error is actually an obligation for this particular system actor. And there's a couple of other parts I've not yet seen any examples for. There's this one, this element called documentation, which looks, since it's marked down, to be the capability to describe the purpose of the obligation in narrative language. I would suggest we want to stay away from that, since we're looking hopefully towards standardizing and making use of those codes. The next part is usage, which is optional and multiple, which allows you to qualify the usage on this. The current sort of examples here are jurisdiction, gender, and workflow status, but this has a new data type, usage context, which is a bit complex. Which allows you to say the kind and then fill out the value. So I guess you could say something like jurisdiction and then Australia. I'll try and pop this link actually. Can someone pop this link in the chat if anyone's on it or can navigate to it easily? If not, I can just do it in a sec. And then there's filters, which are FHIR path expressions, which I think allows you to say complex things like this obligation only applies to elements that fall into this range. And documentation of that. And then they've also enabled the option for process to apply a workflow process. Well, I guess that's really a filter to say that that obligation only applies to. And since it's got value canonical and value URI, that's about operation definition. And that's interesting. So that's the full capabilities of the obligation extension. Certainly, I'm thinking that if where we use it, we would start with just code and actor to use that to clarify our, I guess, where we are in the narrative kind of space around must support and move to a clear position using the terminology that's there. We've only got 5 minutes left. Hopefully this was actually enjoyable for people. I know I got a bit stuck talking through this obligation extension. Are there any other comments or questions we want to get onto before we end this particular chat? Heath. You're on mute? No, you've put your hand down?
Part of the problem I struggle with is some of the complex bits like we started talking about yesterday, where we've got choices of data types or there's multiple sub-elements, and what are the requirements of the responder and the requester. Do these obligations actually help us interpret those scenarios easier? Because I only superficially looked at some of these definitions with you yesterday, but I didn't see anything that kind of said, oh, the requester has to support all sub-elements when the parent is marked as must support.
I'm going to be slightly biased in my response to say I'm not a fan of conditional must supports in that fashion. I think that gets really complex. But potentially it could. There's a couple of filter options there that might be that we could explore for that purpose. Certainly, it's fairly common that our implementation guides put must support on particular data types. So I would expect that the extension obligation has been intentionally defined so that it can do that. And if it's not obvious to us, we can ask Graham basically on how do you do that?
Yeah, that I don't think that was quite my question. I was saying it's if in a basic scenario, we just simply have something like on a patient name and we say it's must support, right? So we have rules in narrative at the moment that says a requester has to be able to support all sub-elements of name, whereas the responder only has to provide one.
Yes.
Do these obligations make that clearer? Or because I think the example of the obligation you were talking about there was handle or shall handle. Does the definition of handle actually say all sub-elements in, because of these complex scenarios? It's easy on a primitive, but when we get to these complex elements with sub-elements or complex types that have choices and things like that, it just gets harder to interpret.
And yes, okay. And I don't think name is necessarily, name is going to be, I think, a good choice. We hadn't defined that properly in must support. So the update of the narrative in EU core hadn't been updated for that. That was part of a separate change that didn't get past the TDG to say, what does it mean that we've done that? I think we need to have the discussion and then see how we define that using the obligation.
Yeah, I think you could be very explicit about every option, right? And that would be helpful in some regards because it would be explicit, but you would have to do all the work to make it explicit, which is
very
yeah.
verbose.
Yeah, yeah. But say you had an obligation you could state, you could then just list the elements that applies to in the options, right? So particular paths. So
Okay.
it might not be so bad. Yeah. Maybe. It's still a lot of work. You got to think about them all, which is actually, I guess, the problem because it's reducing ambiguity really if you do it all, obviously.
So it's more work on us as a technical design group to go, what do we really mean, what the requirements are, so that then we can present that clearly, and potentially then asking when it gets rendered for that to actually be clear.
Yeah, because I mean, it all heads towards having a complete interactive validator as well, right? So that's where it can actually test all the interactions fully as well as just validating data.
I guess that's where this is all heading, is to be able to compute these things, because at the moment must port can't be computed.
Yeah.
And Inferno is a good example of something that is actually trying to interpret these capability statements and generate things, which has already done a very good job of, but this is that next level.
Yeah.
All right, we're at time, so I'll get Andrew to have the final comment, and then we'll close.
I do want to say let's not too far jump ahead of ourselves to Inferno and to all these toolings, because I recognize their value in testing all of our implementations, but we still, as a technical design group, need to agree on which, at the end of the day, which are the elements that are important to include in our implementation guide to say this is how we achieve interoperability. That's at the core of it, what must support's doing. Say these are the elements that you shall populate when you're doing a message, and that's where we can start as a building point. So as much as we have all the cool capabilities in the obligations, and we should be applying the obligation concept, we still just need to focus on that refinement of the individual elements to say, these are the elements we care about. These are the purposeful things we need to include, which is really the starting point before we get too far into these obligations.
It's very, very pragmatic.
Thanks, Andrew. And with that closing message, we'll close the meeting. Thanks, everyone, for your time on this Friday afternoon, and I'll see you next Friday for more Conformance Friday.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks all.
All right.
Have I stopped recording? Have I stopped recording? No.
No, it's still going.